Part 1. They caged the ships came on a Tuesday morning. 3,000 of them. They appeared in the sky without warning, blocking out the sun over every major city on Earth. People stopped in the streets and looked up. Cars crashed into each other as drivers forgot to watch the road. Children pointed at the massive shapes hanging in the clouds. Nobody screamed at first. They were too shocked to scream. The ships were beautiful in a terrible way. Their hulls were smooth and black, like polished stone. They moved without sound, without fire, without any sign of how they stayed in the air. Each one was bigger than a football stadium. Some were bigger than mountains. They hung there in perfect formation, casting shadows that turned day into night. Within 1 hour, every satellite around Earth went dark. Television screens showed static. Radio stations fell silent. The internet stopped working. Airplanes fell from the sky as their electronics failed. Power grids collapsed across entire continents. Humanity had spent a century building a connected world, and in 60 minutes, that world was gone. Then the message came. Every screen that still worked showed the same image. A creature that was not human. It had gray skin covered in small scales. Its eyes were large and yellow, with pupils that looked like black crosses. It had no nose, just 2 small slits above a wide mouth filled with needle-like teeth. When it spoke, the words came in perfect English, perfect Mandarin, perfect Spanish, every language at once. "I am Admiral Kethvorin of the Varth hegemony," the creature said. "Your world is now under our control. You will not resist. You cannot resist. We have conquered 847 species across this galaxy. Not one has ever broken our blockade. Not one has ever escaped our judgment. You are no different." The Admiral explained what would happen next. Humanity would surrender all weapons. All governments would dissolve. All people would be counted, sorted, and assigned to work colonies across the galaxy. Earth's resources would be harvested. Its water, its metals, its very soil would be taken to feed the hegemony's endless hunger. "You have 72 hours to comply," Kethvorin finished. "After that, we will begin forced collection. Any resistance will result in the destruction of population centers. This is not a negotiation. This is your reality." The screen went dark. For 3 days the world argued. Presidents and prime ministers held emergency meetings. Generals studied the alien ships through telescopes and found no weakness. Scientists analyzed the energy signatures and admitted they understood nothing. Religious leaders called for prayer. Protesters filled the streets demanding action. Though nobody knew what action to take, in the end, the United Nations voted to surrender. The vote was not close. What choice did they have? Humanity had no weapons that could reach orbit. No ships that could fight. No technology that could even scratch those black holes. Fighting would only mean dying faster. Most governments followed the UN's lead. White flags rose over Capitol buildings. Military bases opened their gates. Soldiers laid down their weapons and waited for the aliens to come. But not everyone surrendered. Deep beneath a mountain in Colorado, a group of military officers gathered in a bunker that was not supposed to exist. General Marcus Chun of the United States Space Force sat at the head of a long table. He was 63 years old, with gray hair cut short and a face that showed no fear. Across from him sat Admiral Yevgenia Volkov of Russia, a woman with ice-blue eyes who had spent her career preparing for wars that never came. Beside her was General Liu Wei of China, a small man with glasses who spoke rarely but thought constantly. These 3 nations had spent decades pointing nuclear weapons at each other. They had spied on each other, threatened each other, hated each other. Now they sat together as friends, united by something stronger than old anger. "They have rules," Chun said, spreading papers across the table. For 3 days, his teams have been intercepting Varth communications, studying their movements, learning their patterns. Look at this. They follow specific flight paths. They avoid certain areas. They have designated attack zones and designated safe zones. They are organized, Volkov agreed. Disciplined, predictable. They are civilized, Li Wei said quietly. They fight according to laws, rules of engagement, protection of civilians, limits on weapons. He looked up from the papers. They have spent 10,000 years learning how to conquer species without destroying them. They are very good at it. Chun nodded. And that is exactly their weakness. The other two looked at him. They have never fought something like us, Chun continued. They have conquered peaceful species, primitive species, logical species, species that saw the math and gave up, species that followed rules. He stood up and walked to a map of the world. But humans do not follow rules. Not when we are desperate. Not when we are cornered. Volkov understood first. Her face went pale. You are talking about total war. I am talking about survival. The cost would be... Li Wei stopped. He could not finish the sentence. Millions, Chun said. Maybe billions. Maybe most of us. He turned to face them. But not all of us. We have spent our entire history fighting each other. We have burned cities. We have poisoned lands. We have killed each other in numbers that would make any other species collapse. And we are still here. He pointed at the ceiling, at the sky above, at the ships that waited there. They want to take our world. Fine, let them try. But they will learn something that no other species has taught them. They will learn what humans do when there is no hope, no mercy, no escape. His voice dropped to a whisper. We fight anyway. We fight until there is nothing left. We break every rule, cross every line, commit every horror. And we make them pay for every inch of ground in blood and fire. Volkov was quiet for a long time. Then she laughed, a bitter sound that held no joy. God help us, she said. God help us all. God will not help us, Chun replied. We must help ourselves. High above Earth, Admiral Keth Varn reviewed his fleet's status and found everything perfect. The blockade was holding. The surrender was proceeding. Another conquest, another trophy, another world added to the hegemony's collection. He had no idea that in bunkers around the world, humans were making plans. He had no idea that old enemies were becoming allies. He had no idea that the species he had trapped was not a species that accepted cages. He would learn soon enough. They all would. Part 2. The unthinkable Varth had rules for war. They called them the laws of proper warfare, and every species in the galaxy followed them. These laws were older than the hegemony itself. They existed because the galaxy had learned a hard lesson long ago. Total war, war without limits, led to total death. Species that fought without rules destroyed themselves and their enemies. Planets became wastelands. Stars went dark. Entire regions of space became graveyards. So the laws were made. Military forces could fight military forces. Civilians could not be targeted. Cities could not be destroyed. Weapons that killed too many at once were forbidden. Lies and tricks were limited to small things, not big ones. Prisoners were treated well. Surrender was respected. Every species followed these rules. Every species understood that civilization depended on them. The Varth had conquered hundreds of worlds using proper warfare. They were masters of it. They won through superior technology, superior numbers, superior planning. They did not need to break the rules. They were simply better. Humanity did not know about these rules. Humanity had never received the message about civilized warfare. Humanity had spent its entire existence fighting itself, and in those fights, There were no rules at all, Don. The first attack came 2 weeks after the surrender. The Vorath had landed. Massive machines on Earth's surface. These machines generated the energy field that kept the blockade in place. Without them, the shield around the planet would fail. The ships could still fight, but the blockade itself would have holes, gaps, weaknesses. Admiral Kethvorin had placed these generators near major cities. This was standard practice. Civilized species would never bomb their own population centers. The machines were safe there, protected by the enemy's own morality. At 3:47 a.m. local time, nuclear missiles launched from submarines in the Atlantic Ocean, more launched from hidden silos in Siberia, more from mobile platforms in western China. The missiles did not fly toward the Vorath ships. They flew toward Earth, toward the generators, toward the cities. The first warhead hit London. The blast turned everything within 5 miles into fire and ash. 3 million people died in less than a second. The generator there was destroyed. The second warhead hit Delhi. 8 million dead. Generator destroyed. The third hit Sao Paulo. 4 million dead. Generator destroyed. By the time the sun rose, 12 cities had been erased. 40 million humans were dead, killed by their own weapons, fired by their own leaders. The blockade grid was failing. Holes were opening in the energy field. Admiral Kethvorin stood on his command deck and watched his displays with eyes that could not understand what they showed. His officers were silent. His tactical systems were screaming alarms that made no sense. "They bombed themselves," he said. His voice was barely a whisper. "They killed their own people, their own cities." "Admiral," his second officer said, "this violates 17 articles of the laws of proper warfare. No species has ever. I can see what they did." Kethvorin's shout echoed through the deck. "I want to know why." The answer came before anyone could speak. Human ships were launching, thousands of them. Cargo planes, passenger jets, old military aircraft, rockets built in factories and garages and school gymnasiums. Anything that could fly, anything that could carry weight, anything that could reach orbit. They poured through the gaps in the blockade like water through a broken dam. The Vorath Point defense systems opened fire, destroying hundreds in seconds. But more kept coming. Always more. And they were not trying to escape. They were trying to hit the first cargo. Plane struck a Vorath destroyer at full speed. The plane was carrying 10 tons of explosives mixed with scrap metal. The explosion tore through the destroyer's hull, killing 300 Vorath crew members. The plane's pilot, a woman named Maria Santos, who had been a commercial pilot for 20 years, died instantly. She had volunteered for the mission, knowing she would not survive. More impacts followed. More explosions. More deaths on both sides. The Vorath ships were far stronger than the human aircraft, but the attacks were not meant to destroy the fleet. They were meant to wound it, to cost it, to make it bleed. "Ramming attacks," Kethvorin said. "Suicide strikes. They are throwing away their own lives to scratch our paint." His tactical officer's voice was shaking. "Admiral, we have lost 4 destroyers. 12 cruisers are damaged. The humans are not stopping. They are accelerating. Why would anyone do this?" Kethvorin demanded. "What species kills itself to fight?" Nobody answered. In the bunker beneath Colorado, General Chun watched the same displays. Beside him, Admiral Volkov was crying silently. Tears ran down her cheeks, but her expression did not change. General Liu Wei had not spoken in hours. He simply stared at the numbers. "The deaths. The cost. 40 million, Volkov said. "We killed 40 million of our own people." "The generators are down," Chun replied. His voice was flat, empty. "The blockade is breaking. We can reach them now. At what price? Chun turned to look at her. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had crossed a line and could never go back. The price of survival, he said. There is no price too high for survival. We are monsters. Yes, Chun did not argue. We are. And that is why we will win. Above Earth, the Varth fleet was pulling back, tightening its formation, trying to establish new defensive positions. They were not retreating. They were regrouping. They still had 3,000 ships against a planet that had just proven it would destroy itself to fight back. But something had changed. The Varth had spent 10,000 years conquering species that followed rules, species that calculated odds, species that surrendered when the math was against them. They had never faced anything like this. They did not know how to fight an enemy that considered millions of deaths acceptable. They did not know how to defeat a species that simply refused to stop. Kathvaran looked at his displays and felt something he had never felt before in his long career. Fear. What are they? He asked quietly. No one was supposed to hear him, but his second officer did. They are humans, Admiral, the officer said. And I think we have made a terrible mistake coming here. Kathvaran said nothing. He was beginning to agree. Part 3. The Horror of Varth were quick learners. They had not conquered 800 worlds by being stupid. Within days of the first suicide attacks, they had adapted. Their ships flew in tighter formations. Their weapons tracked faster. Their shields overlapped, creating walls of energy that nothing human could pass. The stream of kamikaze aircraft slowed, then stopped. There was no point wasting pilots on attacks that could not succeed. The humans had made their point. They had proven they were willing to die. Now they needed a new strategy. General Chun stood before a room full of scientists, engineers, and military officers from every nation that still resisted. The room was underground, lit by emergency lights, cold and damp. But the people inside burned with something that kept the cold away. Every attack teaches us something, Chun said. Every ship we lose gives us data. Weapon signatures, shield frequencies, communication codes. We know more about Varth technology now than we did a month ago. We need to use that knowledge. Dr. Sarah Okonkwo raised her hand. She was a small woman from Nigeria, with kind eyes and gentle hands. She had spent her entire career studying bacteria and viruses, tiny things that lived in places too harsh for anything else. Hot springs, Arctic ice, the bottom of the ocean. She understood how life survived when survival seemed impossible. I have an idea, she said, but you will not like it. Chun looked at her. Tell me. Okonkwo explained. The Varth had landed ground forces before pulling back to orbit. During that time, human doctors had examined Varth bodies. They had learned how the aliens breathed, how their blood worked, how their immune systems protected them. They are vulnerable to infection, Okonkwo said. Their environment suits have small gaps for comfort. Their decontamination systems assume clean warfare. They are not prepared for deliberate biological attack. The room went silent. You want to create a plague, someone said. I want to create a weapon, Okonkwo corrected. A weapon we can deliver through the only vector they will not expect. She paused. Us, infected humans walking into Varth processing centers, coughing on guards, bleeding on equipment, dying in holding cells. We would be using our own people as disease carriers, Volkov said, sending sick civilians to infect the enemy. Yes, that is. Volkov searched for a word. That is evil. That is survival. Chen's voice cut through the argument. Do it. The plague took 3 weeks to develop. It was not elegant. It was not sophisticated. It was a modified flu virus, changed just enough to attack Varth respiratory systems. Humans who carried it showed mild symptoms. A cough, a fever. Nothing serious. For the Vorath, it was death. The first carriers were volunteers. People who had lost everything in the nuclear strikes. People who wanted revenge. People who simply wanted to matter, to do something, to fight back in the only way they could. They walked into Vorath processing centers with their heads down and their lungs full of poison dot within 3 days. Vorath soldiers started dying. The plague spread faster than anyone expected. The aliens had no immunity, no resistance, no understanding of what was happening. Their doctors worked around the clock, but they were treating symptoms they had never seen before. By the end of the first week, a quarter of their ground forces were sick. By the end of the second week, half were dead. Cathvoran received the reports with growing horror. He had seen plagues before. Every species dealt with disease. But this was different. This was deliberate. This was warfare using sickness as a weapon, using civilians as delivery systems, using death itself as a strategy. Pull back all ground forces, he ordered. No Vorath sets foot on that planet again. We will conduct all operations from orbit. His officers obeyed quickly. They were afraid now. They had come to Earth expecting a simple conquest and found something else entirely. Something that did not fight fair. Something that did not fight clean. Something that fought with every tool available. No matter how horrible, but the retreat from the surface was exactly what the humans wanted, with no Vorath on the ground. Humanity could rebuild without interference. Factories that had been shut down started running again. Scientists worked in shifts, sleeping only when they collapsed. Engineers took captured Vorath technology apart piece by piece, learning its secrets, copying what they could, improving what they could not, and in hidden bases around the world. A new weapon was being built. The humans had learned something important from the suicide attacks. The Vorath ships could be hurt. Their shields could be overwhelmed. Their hulls could be breached. The key was numbers. Enough impacts, enough explosions, enough pressure, and even the strongest defense would crack. Building enough manned aircraft would take years. But drones were faster, simpler, cheaper. A factory that took a month to build a fighter jet could build 1,000 drones in the same time. They did not need life support. They did not need cockpits. They did not need anything except engines, explosives, and basic guidance systems. The drone swarms launched 6 weeks after the plague began. They came from everywhere. From factories in China and India and Brazil. From workshops in garages and basements. From schools where students had learned to build simple robots. Millions of them, rising into the sky like locusts, blotting out the sun. The Vorath point defense systems opened fire. Lasers and missiles cut through the swarms, destroying thousands every second. But thousands more kept coming. They overwhelmed targeting systems. They clogged intake vents. They crashed into sensor arrays and communication dishes and shield generators. A single drone could not hurt a Vorath ship. 10 drones could not hurt it. 100 could not. But 10,000 could. 100,000 could. 1,000,000 could. And there were always more. Cathvoran watched his fleet die by 1,000 small cuts. His ships were not being destroyed. They were being eaten alive, slowly, painfully, relentlessly. What do we do? His tactical officer asked. How do we fight this? Cathvoran had no answer. His entire career, his entire understanding of warfare, was built on rules that these humans did not follow. He knew how to fight armies. He knew how to break defenses. He knew how to win wars. That he did not know how to fight a species that turned disease into weapons and civilians into soldiers and death into victory. Admiral, his communications officer said, "We are receiving broadcasts from the surface." "On all frequencies." "What kind of broadcasts?" "They are." Stories, Admiral. Histories. Tales of human wars. Cathvorin listened. He heard about trenches filled with corpses and clouds of poison gas. He heard about cities burned to ash by fire falling from the sky. He heard about machetes and mass graves and children with rifles. He heard about species that had spent 10,000 years learning to kill itself in every way possible. And he understood, finally, what he was facing, not a species fighting for survival. A species that had never known anything else. Part 4. The turn the psychological broadcasts continued for weeks. Every frequency, every channel, every method of communication the humans could find. They sent their stories to the Varath fleet, and the Varath could not stop listening. They heard about a war where soldiers lived in muddy holes in the ground for years, where poison gas melted lungs and burned skin, where young men walked into machine gun fire knowing they would die, wave after wave, until the guns ran out of bullets or the bodies piled too high to cross. 20 million dead. One war, one planet, one species fighting itself. They heard about bombs that turned cities into shadows, where the heat was so intense that people left outlines burned into walls before they vanished, where children born years later were still sick from the poison in the air. 2 bombs, 2 cities, hundreds of thousands dead in seconds. And the species that dropped those bombs did not collapse, did not give up, did not even slow down. They heard about a place called Rwanda, where neighbors killed neighbors with farming tools. About Cambodia, where glasses made you an enemy of the state. About Armenia and Bosnia and Darfur, and 100 other names that meant the same thing. Humans killing humans for reasons that made no sense to anyone looking from outside. The Varath psychologists studied these broadcasts. They analyzed the data. They tried to understand. They are insane, the chief psychologist told Admiral Cathvorin. His voice was not steady. His hand shook as he held his report. Not strategically insane. Not tactically insane. Fundamentally insane. Their entire psychology is built around conflict. How can they function? Cathvorin asked. How can any species survive this way? They adapt. They endure. They rebuild. The psychologist set down his report. Every other species we have conquered reached a breaking point, a level of loss that made them stop fighting. The humans do not have that point. We cannot find it. It may not exist. There must be something, some limit. We thought the nuclear strikes would be that limit. We thought the plague would be that limit. We thought the drone swarms would be that limit. The psychologist met Cathvorin's eyes. We were wrong every time. They keep finding new ways to fight, new horrors to unleash, new sacrifices to make. What are you telling me? I am telling you that we cannot break them. Not with this fleet. Not with 10 fleets. They will lose billions and keep fighting. They will destroy their own world and keep fighting. They will follow us across the galaxy and keep fighting. The psychologist's voice dropped to a whisper. We should leave, Admiral. While we still can. Cathvorin dismissed the psychologist but could not dismiss his words. The fleet had lost 400 ships to the drone swarms. The plague had killed 30,000 ground troops before the evacuation. Morale was crumbling. Soldiers who had never known fear were waking from nightmares, and the humans were not done. The first captured Varath ship appeared in orbit 3 months after the invasion began. It was a small scout vessel, one of dozens that had crashed during the initial attacks. The humans had found it, repaired it, learned its systems, crewed it with volunteers who knew they were flying a one-way mission. The ship's identification codes were still valid. The fleet's sensors saw it as friendly. By the time anyone realized the truth, the ship was inside the flagship's hangar bay. The explosion killed 2,000 Varath. It tore a hole in the flagship that took weeks to repair. It nearly killed Kethvorin himself. He survived only because he had been in a shielded command center instead of the bridge dot as he floated in the wreckage. Watching the bodies of his crew drift past, he finally understood what the psychologist had been trying to tell him. Humanity was not fighting a war. They were fighting extinction. And when a species faced extinction, there were no rules, no limits, no lines that could not be crossed. The humans had never learned civilized warfare because they had never needed to. They had spent their entire existence fighting for survival against themselves. Every generation had faced some new horror, some new threat, some new enemy. And every generation had found a way to survive, not through wisdom, not through peace, through pure, relentless, unbreakable will. Back on Earth, General Chun received the news about the flagship attack. He did not celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate. The cost had been too high. The volunteers who had flown that mission were dead. The families they left behind were grieving. The victory, if it could be called that, was written in blood. But the attack had worked. The Vorath were pulling back, consolidating their remaining ships, trying to establish a defensive position. They were no longer trying to conquer Earth. They were trying to survive. Chun gathered his commanders for one final briefing. "We have hurt them," he said, "but they still have over 2,000 ships. If we give them time to regroup, they will adapt. They will find new tactics. They will return stronger." He looked around the room. "We cannot give them that time. What do you propose?" Liu Wei asked. "Everything. Every weapon we have. Every ship. Every drone. Every person willing to fight." Chun's voice was hard. "We hit them now, while they are wounded. We hit them with everything. And we do not stop until they are gone, or we are." Admiral Volkov stood. Her uniform was torn and dirty. She had not slept in days, but her eyes were clear. "This will be the end," she said. "One way or another. We throw everything into this attack, we will have nothing left." "We had nothing left anyway," Chun replied. "Our cities are craters. Our population is dying. Our world is burning." He gestured at the displays showing the Vorath fleet. "They came here to take everything from us. Let us show them the price." The final assault began 12 hours later. It was not a battle. It was apocalypse. Nuclear missiles, drone swarms, captured ships loaded with explosives, chemical weapons, biological weapons, weapons that had been banned by every nation on Earth, now launched at a common enemy. And behind all of it, the last human fighters, pilots who knew they would not return, soldiers who had said goodbye to their families, ordinary people who had volunteered for missions that were one-way trips. They fought with weapons and fists and teeth. They rammed Vorath ships with cargo containers. They detonated bombs strapped to their chests. They died by the thousands, by the tens of thousands, and they did not stop. The Vorath fought back. They killed humans by the millions. They destroyed ship after ship, drone after drone. But for every human they killed, 10 more appeared. For every attack they stopped, 3 more came. And slowly, the Vorath began to lose. Kethvorin stood on what remained of his command deck and watched his fleet die. Ships that had served the hegemony for centuries were breaking apart under the endless assault. Officers who had conquered dozens of worlds were dying at their posts. Everything he had built, everything he had believed in, was crumbling around him. "Admiral," his last surviving aide said, "the fleet cannot survive this. We must retreat." Kethvorin looked at the aide. Then he looked at the display showing Earth, burning and broken and still fighting. "Signal the fleet," he said quietly. "All ships withdraw to emergency coordinates. We are leaving." "Admiral," The hegemony will. The hegemony will what?
Punish me?
Kethvorin laughed. It was not a happy sound. Let them. I have learned something today that the hegemony needs to know. There are species you conquer, and there are species you leave alone. The retreat signal went out. The surviving Vorath ships, fewer than 400 now, began to pull back. Their engines flared as they turned away from Earth, away from the nightmare planet, away from the species that had broken every rule and won anyway. Behind them, humanity watched them go and did not stop fighting until the last ship was gone. Part 5. The reckoning. The silence was the strangest part. After 4 months of constant battle, constant death, constant noise, the silence felt wrong. People looked up at the sky and saw nothing but clouds and stars. No black ships, no flashing weapons, no falling debris. The Vorath were gone. Earth had won. The cost was beyond counting. Before the invasion, 8 billion people had lived on the planet. Now there were 5 billion. 3 billion dead from nuclear strikes, from plagues, from starvation, from the 1,000 small disasters that came with total war. Cities that had stood for centuries were now glass craters. Farmland that had fed millions was poisoned and dead. The oceans were choked with wreckage. The sky was thick with ash that would not clear for years, but humanity had survived. Broken, bleeding, scarred, but alive. General Chun stood at a podium in what had once been Geneva. The old UN building was gone, destroyed in the early days of the invasion. This was a temporary structure built from salvaged materials, standing in a field of rubble. Behind him, screens showed the feeds from every surviving city on Earth. Billions watched. 4 months ago, Chun began. An alien fleet came to our world. They had conquered 847 species. They had never lost a war. They came to take everything we had, everything we were, everything we would ever be. He paused. The wind carried the smell of smoke and ash. They failed. No cheers rose from the crowd. No celebration. The victory was too costly for joy. But something passed through the people listening. Something that might have been pride, or defiance, or simply the stubborn refusal to break that had carried humanity through the darkest months of its existence. We did things in this war that will haunt us forever, Chun continued. We bombed our own cities. We unleashed plagues. We sent our own people to die in suicide attacks. We crossed every line, broke every rule, committed every horror that war allows. He looked directly at the cameras. And I would do it again. We all would. Because the alternative was extinction. The alternative was watching our children sorted into labor camps. The alternative was seeing our world harvested for parts while we stood by and did nothing. His voice hardened. We are not proud of what we did, but we are not ashamed either. We survived. Against impossible odds, against an enemy we could not match, against a universe that said we should have surrendered, we survived. That is what humanity does. That is what humanity has always done. Far away, in the retreating Vorath fleet, Admiral Kethvorin composed his final report. He wrote about the invasion, the resistance, the horrors he had witnessed. He wrote about suicide attacks and bioweapons and a species that would rather burn its own world than surrender it. His report went to the Hegemony High Command. From there, it spread to the Galactic Council, the ancient body that governed all civilized space. Within weeks, every species in the galaxy knew what had happened at Earth. The reactions varied. Some species were horrified. They could not imagine fighting without rules, dying without meaning, sacrificing everything for mere survival. The Vorath method was brutal, yes, but at least it was organized. At least it made sense. Humanity made no sense. Humanity was chaos wearing a uniform. Humanity was a species that had spent its entire existence at war with itself, and somehow turned that madness into a weapon. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session. For 10,000 years, the laws of proper warfare had governed all conflict between species. They had prevented extinction events. They had kept the galaxy stable. They had worked because every species followed them. Now, they faced a species that did not, could not, would not. We cannot force them to follow the laws, the Vorath representative admitted. They do not understand them. They do not want to understand them. Their entire psychology is built around total war. Then, what do? Demanded the representative from the Galaxy Collective. What happens when they develop faster than light travel? When they can reach our worlds? The debate lasted for days. Some argued for preemptive strikes, destroying humanity before they could become a threat. But the Vorath experience showed the danger of that approach. Attack Earth, and Earth would attack back, forever, without end, without mercy. Others argued for diplomacy, for bringing humanity into the galactic community, for teaching them civilized ways. But could you teach a species to forget everything it had ever known? Could you unlearn 10,000 years of constant war? In the end, the Council chose a third option. The amendment to the laws of proper warfare was short and direct. No signatory species shall initiate hostilities with the human homeworld. Sol 3 is hereby classified as a quarantine zone. Any species that violates this amendment will receive no support from the Council, military or otherwise. The galaxy was not welcoming humanity. The galaxy was locking them out, building a fence around their solar system and hoping they never found a way through. On Earth, none of this mattered. People were too busy surviving to care about galactic politics. They rebuilt cities from the ashes. They planted crops in poisoned soil. They buried their dead and raised their children and did what humans had always done, kept going. General Chun became Secretary General of the United Earth Defense Council, the new government that had emerged from the war. His first act was to establish a permanent orbital watch. His second was to begin construction on humanity's first true warships. We will not be caught unprepared again, he told his people. We will not wait for the next invasion. We will be ready. We will be strong. And if anyone comes for our world again, they will find something worse than what the Vorath found. 50 years passed. The first human exploration vessels crossed the borders of Vorath space on a quiet morning that most humans did not notice. The ships were not large. They were not heavily armed by galactic standards. But they flew the flag of Earth, and that flag now meant something in the galaxy. The Vorath met them with diplomats, not weapons. Nervous diplomats who remembered the war, who had heard the stories, who knew what humanity was capable of. They offered trade agreements, non-aggression pacts, technology exchanges, anything to keep the humans peaceful. The humans accepted. They were polite. They were professional. They smiled and shook hands and signed treaties in languages they had only learned in the last decade. But the Vorath noticed something that the humans did not try to hide. Every human ship, even the smallest cargo hauler, carried weapons. Lots of weapons. More weapons than any other species would consider reasonable. Their ships were designed to fight. Their crews were trained to fight. Their entire culture, it seemed, was built around the assumption that peace was temporary and war was always one moment away. One Vorath diplomat asked a human captain about this. Why so many weapons? Why such heavy armor? Why prepare for war in a time of peace? The captain smiled. It was not a friendly smile. Because we remember, she said. We remember the blockade. We remember the bombs. We remember the plague and the drones and the suicide attacks. We remember what it cost to survive. Her smile faded. And we will never let it happen again. The diplomat nodded slowly. He understood. Humanity would never forget what had been done to them. Never forgive. Never lower their guard. They were not conquered people pretending to be free. They were survivors. And survivors did not forget. The galaxy had tried to put Earth in a cage once. It had learned the price of that mistake. Now, humanity was walking among the stars. And every species they met saw the same thing in their eyes. The fire that had burned the Larath fleet. The will that had refused to break. The promise that they would never kneel. Never surrender. Never stop fighting, no matter the cost. Humanity had entered the galaxy. And the galaxy would never be the same. On a small monument in what had once been Geneva, words were carved in every human language. Billions visited it every year. Children learned those words in school. Soldiers whispered them before battle. They read, "We survived." And beneath that, smaller, but no less important, "We will always survive." The end.